The apartment was quiet save for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the building settled into the night. Nomi lay in bed, her slender frame nestled beneath the cool silken sheets, her mind drifting in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness. The soft glow of the city outside filtered through the curtains, casting muted shadows across the walls of her bedroom. She had always found solace in the stillness of the late hours, a rare moment of peace in her otherwise hectic life as a graphic designer, but tonight something was off. A faint noise broke the silence, a soft thud like a drawer being opened. Nomi's eyes fluttered open, her senses sharpening. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound came again, this time accompanied by the subtle rustle of fabric. Her heart quickened. Curtis was home, but he should have been asleep by now. What was he doing? She slipped out of bed, her bare feet padding silently across the wooden floor. The cool air kissed her skin as she moved toward the source of the noise, the walk-in closet just down the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of curiosity and unease knotting in her stomach. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame inside. Curtis stood frozen, his back to her. The dim light from the closet illuminated his tall, all-lean frame. He was dressed in a loose t-shirt and pajama pants, his dark hair slightly tousled from sleep, but it wasn't his appearance that caught Nomi's attention. It was what he held in his hands, a red thong. Nomi's breath caught in her throat. The delicate lace piece was one of her favorites, a purchase she'd made on a whim during a rare moment of indulgence. Its vibrant hue and intricate detailing were designed to accentuate her curves, a small act of self-love in a world that often demanded too much of her. And now here it was, clutched in her son's hands. Curtis's shoulders tensed as if he'd sensed her presence. Slowly he turned to face her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something else, something that made Nomi's cheeks flush. His gaze flickered from her face to the thong in his hands and back again, his expression a whirlwind of emotions she could quite decipher. Mom, he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. Nomi held up a hand, cutting him off. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. How had he found it? Why was he holding it like that? And most importantly, what was she supposed to do now? Curtis, she said, her voice steadier. Then she felt, what are you doing? He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the thong. I don't know, I was just curious. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Nomi's mind flashed back to the last few weeks, the way Curtis had been watching her more intently, the way his gaze sometimes lingered a little too long. She had dismissed it as typical teenage awkwardness, but now she wasn't so sure. Curious, she repeated, her tone softening. Despite herself, she took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. About what, my underwear? Curtis's face turned crimson and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I didn't mean to, Mom, it's just you're so beautiful and I couldn't help it. The words hit Nomi like a punch to the gut. Her son, her sweet, shy, awkward son, was standing in front of her, confessing his attraction to her. It was surreal, like something out of a forbidden dream. She felt a rush of emotions, shock, discomfort, but also a flicker of something she didn't want to acknowledge. A part of her was flattered, even as her maternal instinct screamed at her to shut this down. Curtis, she began, her voice trembling slightly, this isn't right. You're my son. I know, he said quickly, his voice thick with guilt. I know it's wrong, Mom. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't. Every time I see you, he trailed off, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Nomi's heart ACHD for him. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the struggle between his feelings and the knowledge that they were taboo. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it was okay, but she knew she couldn't not like this. Curtis, listen to me, she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. What you're feeling, it's normal. You're at an age where everything feels intense and confusing, but this can't happen. Do you understand? He nodded, but the look in his eyes told her that he wasn't ready to let it go. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to make things weird. It's okay, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was. She took the thong from his hands, her fingers brushing against his for a fleeting moment. The contact sent a jolt through her, a spark of something she quickly pushed aside. Let's just forget this happened. Okay, Curtis nodded again, but the tension between them remained thick. And unspoken Nomi stepped back, giving him space, but her mind was already racing with questions and uncertainties. What did this mean for them? How were they supposed to move forward from here? As she returned to her bedroom, the thong clutched tightly in her hand. Nomi couldn't shake the image of Curtis's face, his wide, guilty eyes, his flushed cheeks, the way his hands had trembled as he held the lace. It was a moment that had shattered the fragile balance of their relationship, leaving them both adrift in a sea of unspoken desires and forbidden feelings. And as she lay back down in bed, the thong still in her grasp, Nomi couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft golden glow across the apartment. Nomi awoke with a start, her body jolting upright as the events of the previous night came rushing back. The image of Curtis standing in her closet, her red thong clutched in his hands, played on repeat in her mind. Her heart raced, her breath quickening as she tried to shake off the weight of it all. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her feet finding the cool wooden floor, the thong now tucked into her nightstand drawer, hidden yet undeniable, felt like a specter haunting her thoughts. She couldn't ignore what had happened, couldn't pretend it was just a fleeting moment of teenage curiosity. Curtis's confession had been raw, vulnerable, and painfully honest. And now Nomi had to decide how to respond. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. As a mother, her instinct was to protect Curtis, to shield him from the complexity and confusion of adult emotions, but as a woman she couldn't deny the flicker of something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. She needed to confront this for both of their sakes. Nomi stood, her leaf frame stretching. As she moved toward the closet, she opened the door, her eyes scanning the array of clothing hanging neatly inside. Her fingers brushed against a silk robe, one she hadn't worn in months. It was a luxurious piece, soft and delicate, with a deep V-neck that hinted at the curves beneath. She hesitated for a moment before slipping it on the smooth fabric, caressing her skin as she tied the belt loosely at her waist. The robe draped elegantly over her figure, its length ending just above her knees. It was revealing without being overt, leaving just enough to the imagination. Nomi turned to the mirror, studying her reflection. Her long dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, her green eyes sharp and determined. She looked confident, powerful, and she realized undeniably alluring. As she made her way to the kitchen, the robe swayed gently with each step, the fabric parting slightly to reveal glimpses of her bare legs. Nomi could hear Curtis moving around the living room, the faint sound of the TV providing a backdrop to the morning. She paused at the doorway, watching him for a moment. He was sitting on the couch, his shoulders hunched, his face buried in his hands. It was a posture of guilt, of shame, one that tugged at her heart even as it stoked the fire of her resolve. She stepped into the room, her presence immediately commanding his attention. Curtis looked up, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. His gaze lingered for a moment too long, his cheeks flushing. As he quickly looked away, Nomi felt a surge of satisfaction, a small victory in this unspoken game they were playing. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and measured. As she moved to the coffee machine, she poured herself a cup, the rich aroma filling the air before turning to face him. "Sleep well?" Curtis shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Yeah, I guess." Nomi raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "You guess didn't sound like you were up late." He hesitated, his eyes darting to her and then away again. I was just thinking about stuff, she repeated, her tone light but probing. "Anything you want to talk about?" Curtis shook his head quickly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "No, it's nothing." Nomi studied him, her expression thoughtful. She knew he was lying, knew he was struggling with the same emotions that had kept her awake half the night, but she also knew that pushing him too hard would only make him retreat further. Instead, she decided to take a different approach. She set her coffee cup on the counter and moved toward the couch, the robe parting slightly as she walked. She could see Curtis's eyes flicker toward her, his breath hitching as he caught a glimpse of her bare skin. She pretended not to notice, instead stopping just a few feet away and leaning against the armrest. "You know, Curtis," she began, her voice soft but firm, "you can talk to me about anything. I'm here for you no matter what." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the floor. "I know, Mom." Nomi hesitated, then took a step closer. She bent down to pick up a stray pillow from the floor, the motion causing the robe to shift and reveal even more of her legs. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Curtis's gaze dart toward her, his cheeks flushing as he quickly looked away. She straightened the pillow in hand and placed it back on the couch. Sometimes, she said, her tone thoughtful, we have moments that feel confusing, like we're not sure what we're supposed to do or how we're supposed to feel, but that's okay, it's part of growing up. Curtis glanced up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and longing. Mom, it's okay, she interrupted gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything right now, just know that I'm here for you no matter what. Her words were meant to reassure him, but the tension between them remained thick and palpable. Nomi could feel the heat of Curtis's gaze as it lingered on her, the way his breath hitched when she leaned in closer. She knew what she was doing, knew the effect her appearance and her touch were having on him, and while a part of her felt guilty for toying with his emotions, another part reveled in the power it gave her. She straightened her hand, lingering on his shoulder for a moment longer before she stepped back. I'm going to get started on breakfast. You want anything? Curtis shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No, I'm good. Nomi nodded, turning toward the kitchen. As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her, tracking her every move. The robe swayed gently with each step, the fabric parting to reveal glimpses of her bare legs and the curve of her hips. She knew he was watching, knew he couldn't look away, and she let him look. It was a silent lesson, a way of showing him the boundaries of their relationship, even as she tempted him to cross them. In the kitchen, Nomi busied herself with preparing breakfast, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She could hear Curtis shifting on the couch, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. She knew he was struggling, knew he was on the edge of something he didn't fully understand, and while she wanted to help him, to guide him through this confusing time, she also knew that she couldn't let him forget who she was, his mother first and foremost. As she cracked eggs into a bowl, Nomi glanced toward the living room. Curtis was still sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, his shoulders tense. She could see the conflict in his posture, the way he was wrestling with his emotions. It was a sight that stirred something deep within her, something she wasn't ready to confront. She turned back to the stove, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the eggs into the pan. The sizzle of the cooking food filled the silence, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside her. Nomi knew that this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and difficult decisions, but for now all she could do was take it one step at a time. Breakfast was ready in minutes, the scent of scrambled eggs and toast filling the air. Nomi poured herself another cup of coffee and carried the plate to the table, her movements calm and measured. She glanced toward the living room where Curtis was still sitting, his posture tense. And Jed, breakfast is ready, she called her voice steady. Come eat. Curtis hesitated, then stood slowly, his movements stiff and awkward. He walked to the table, his eyes downcast, and took a seat. Nomi sat across from him, her gaze fixed on his face as she took a bite of her toast. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tension, but for now it was enough. They get through this one step at a time. The day passed in a haze of unspoken tension. Nomi moved through her tasks, work, emails, laundry, a quick trip to the grocery store, with a sense of detachment, her mind constantly circling back to the events of their previous night and the charged morning that followed. Curtis, for his part, seemed to be doing his best to avoid her, retreating to his room and only emerging when absolutely necessary. The apartment felt smaller, somehow the air thick with unspoken words and lingering glances. By evening, Nomi had had enough. She couldn't keep dancing around the issue, couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. Curtis deserved honesty, and if she was being honest with herself, so did she. She waited until after dinner, when the dishes were done and the TV was muted, before making her move. Curtis was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone, though Nomi could tell he wasn't really paying attention to the screen. His fingers scrolled aimlessly, his expression distant. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and walked over to him. Curtis, she said, her tone firm but gentle, we need to talk. He looked up, his eyes wide and wary. About what? You know what, she replied, sitting down beside him. Couch dipped under her weight, the space between them suddenly feeling smaller than ever. About last night, about this morning, about whatever's been going on between us. Curtis's face flushed and he looked away, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. Mom, I don't think. No, she Interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. She softened her tone, placing a hand on his arm. We can't keep pretending. This isn't happening. You've been avoiding me all day and I get it. I've been doing the same, but we need to address this for both of our sakes. He hesitated, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. I don't know what to say, Nomi sighed, her hand slipping from his arm to rest on the couch between them. Start with the truth. How are you feeling? What's going on in that head of yours? Curtis shook his head, his shoulders slumping. I don't know, Mom. I can't stop thinking about it, about you, and I know it's wrong. I know it's messed up, but I can't help it. You're so beautiful, and he cut himself off, his voice breaking as he buried his face in his hands. Nomi's heart ached at the sight, the raw emotion in his words cutting through her defenses. She reached out instinctively, her hand resting on his back, feeling the tension in his muscles as he tried to hold himself together. Curtis, she said softly, her voice trembling. I'm your mother, you know that, right? No matter what you're feeling, that's never going to change. He nodded, his face still hidden. I know, and that's what makes it so messed up. I don't want to feel this way, but I can't stop it. Every time I see you, I can't help it. Nomi swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew she should shut this down. Should remind him of the boundaries that defined their relationship, but something in the way he spoke, the vulnerability, the honesty, pulled at her in a way she couldn't ignore. She felt a surge of empathy, of understanding, and before she could stop herself, she leaned in closer. Look at me, she said, her voice firm but gentle. Curtis hesitated, then slowly lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with guilt. Nomi's breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze, the intensity of his emotions reflecting her own. Without thinking, she reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek as she wiped away a stray tear. It's okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're not alone in this. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Curtis's eyes widened, his breath hitching as he stared at her for a moment. Neither of them moved, the tension between them crackling like a live wire, and then before Nomi could stop herself, she closed the distance between them, her lips pressing against his in a searing kiss. It was a moment of pure impulse, of raw emotion, and it left them both reeling. Curtis froze for a split second before responding, his hands reaching up to cup her face as he kissed her back with a passion that took her breath away. The world seemed to fade around them, leaving only the heat of their connection, the intensity of their shared longing. But as quickly as it began, Nomi pulled away, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at Curtis, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. He looked just as stunned, his hands still hovering in the air as if he wasn't sure what had just happened. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm sorry, she said quickly, her voice breaking. I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. She stood, her legs shaky, and took a step back, putting distance between them. Curtis's face fell, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. He reached out as if to stop her, but she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I'm your mother, she repeated, her voice stronger now, and we can't do this. It's not right. Curtis nodded, though it was clear he didn't fully agree. His voice was soft, almost pleading. But what if it feels right? Nomi's heart ached at the question, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her resolve. She shook her head, forcing herself to be firm. It doesn't matter how it feels. Some lines can't be crossed. Do you understand? He hesitated, then nodded again, though his eyes were filled with a longing that made her chest tighten. I understand. Nomi took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Good, this can't happen again. We need to move past this for both of our sakes. Curtis didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor. Nomi could see the conflict in his posture, the way he was struggling to accept her words. She wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she knew it would only make things worse. I'm going to bed, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. We talk more tomorrow. Okay. Curtis nodded, though he still wouldn't meet her gaze. Okay. Nomi hesitated, then turned and walked away, her heart heavy with guilt and regret as she reached her bedroom. She leaned against the door, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The kiss, a moment of weakness, a vulnerability, had shattered the fragile balance of their relationship, leaving them both adrift in a sea of unspoken desires and for hidden feelings. And as she crawled into bed, her mind racing, Nomi couldn't shake the lingering taste of Curtis's lips on hers, a reminder of the line they had crossed and the consequences they would have to face. The sun was high and unrelenting, casting a golden glow over the backyard as Nomi stepped out onto the patio. She had spent the morning preparing, her heart racing with a mix of nerves and determination. The tension between her and Curtis had been building for days, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. The pool, she decided, would be the perfect setting, neutral ground where they could let their guards down, even if just for a while. She had chosen her bikini carefully, a sleek crimson design that seemed to be painted onto her body. The fabric hugged her curves with precision, the deep red contrasting sharply against her sun-kissed skin. The top was minimal, barely covering her breasts, while the bottom sat low on her hips, accentuating the slender line of her waist and the gentle swell of her hips. She knew it was bold, perhaps even provocative, but she told herself it was just a swimsuit. Deep down, though, she wanted to see his reaction, to test the boundaries of this new unspoken dynamic. Curtis was already by the pool, lounging in a chair with his sunglasses on his bare chest glistening in the sunlight. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. His gaze traveled over her, his eyes widening as they took in the sight of her in the skimpy bikini. His jaw tightened and he quickly looked away, his cheeks flushing a deep red. "Hey, Nomi," said casually, her tone light as she walked to the edge of the pool. The sunlight caught the droplets of water she splashed onto her skin, making her glisten as she moved. "Thought we could spend the day out here. It's too nice to stay inside." Curtis nodded, his voice strained. "Yeah, sure." Nomi ignored his discomfort, stepping into the pool with a graceful ease. The cool water lapped at her skin, the fabric of her bikini clinging to her body like a second skin. She sank in up to her shoulders, the water rippling around her as she turned to face him. "You coming in? Or are you just going to sit there all day?" He hesitated, then stood, pulling off his sunglasses and tossing them onto the chair. Nomi's eyes flickered over his toned chest, the way the muscles rippled as he moved. She quickly looked away, her own cheeks warming as he stepped into the pool. The water rippled around him as he joined her, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. For a while they swam in silence, the tension between them thick and unspoken. But then Nomi decided to break the ice in the only way she knew how. Playfully she splashed him, the water hitting him square in the chest. He looked at her, startled, and then a slow grin spread across his face. "Oh, it's like that, huh?" he said, his tone teasing as he splashed her back. The water fight escalated quickly, their laughter filling the air as they chased each other around the pool. Nomi's bikini clung to her body, the fabric accentuating every curve, and she could feel Curtis's eyes on her as they played his teasing comments. Lighthearted but laced with something deeper, added fuel to the already charged atmosphere. "Nice swimsuit," he said, his voice low as he circled her in the water. His eyes lingered on the way the fabric hugged her hips, the way the water made her skin glisten. "Didn't think you'd go for something so bold." Nomi raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on her lips. She twirled in the water, the movement making her hair cling to her shoulders and the bikini straps slipped slightly. What can I say? I like to make an impression." Curtis's gaze darkened, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the playful energy giving way to something more intense. The water seemed to hum between them, the tension crackling like electricity. Nomi could feel the heat of his gaze, the way his eyes traced every inch of her body. It was intoxicating, dangerous, and she couldn't deny the thrill it gave her. She splashed him again, breaking the moment, and he retaliated with a playful growl, chasing her through the water. The laughter returned, the tension momentarily forgotten as they let themselves be swept up in the game. But even as they played, the undercurrent of attraction remained, a silent acknowledgement of the line they were both towing. The pool became their sanctuary, a temporary escape from the unspoken tension that filled the rest of the house. Nomi and Curtis spent hours there, splashing, laughing, and teasing each other in a way that felt both familiar and dangerously new. The water fight had eased some of the awkwardness between them, but it had also heightened their awareness of each other's bodies. Every brush of skin, every lingering glance sent sparks through the air. Nomi floated lazily on her back, the sun warming her face as she let the water cradle her body. She could feel Curtis's eyes on her, his gaze tracing the contours of her figure beneath the shimmering surface. She pretended not to notice, keeping her eyes closed and her expression relaxed, but her heart raced with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "You're really good at that," Curtis said, his voice soft but laced with something deeper. Nomi cracked open an eye, glancing At him with a smirk. Good at what floating, he chuckled, shaking his head no. At I don't know being you, she laughed softly, the sound carrying over the water. That's a weird compliment, but I'll take it. Curtis swam closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on hers. You know what I mean, Mom, you're confident. It's kind of intimidating. Nomi raised an eyebrow, sitting up in the water so she could face him fully. The movement caused the bikini top to shift slightly, and she saw his gaze flicker down for a split second before snapping back up. Intimidating? Since when am I intimidating? He shrugged, his cheeks flushing. I don't know, it's just you're always so sure of yourself, like you know exactly what you want and you're not afraid to go for it. She smiled, though her heart ached at the admiration in his voice. It's called being an adult, Curtis. You'll get there someday. He didn't respond right away, his gaze dropping to the water as he traced patterns on the surface. Sometimes I wish I was already there. Nomi watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. She wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she knew how dangerous it could be. Instead, she kept her tone light. Trust me. Adulthood isn't all it's cracked up to be. Enjoy being young while you can. Curtis looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Is that what you're doing, enjoying being young? She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I mean, he swam a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're always so put together, but sometimes I see this other side of you, like when you wear that bikini or when you kissed me. Nomi's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected him to bring that up here now. Curtis, that was, I know, he interrupted, his voice firm, but it happened and I can't stop thinking about it. Her eyes searched his face, trying to gauge his intentions. What are you saying? He swallowed hard, his eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and determination. I'm saying I don't want to ignore it anymore. I want to understand it. Nomi stared at him, her mind racing. She knew this was dangerous, knew they were treading on thin ice, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Understanding it doesn't mean acting on it, she said carefully, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Curtis nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. I know, but I need to know that you feel it too, that it's not just me. Her heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. She wanted to lie, to tell him it was just a mistake, but she couldn't. It's not just you, she admitted softly, but that doesn't mean we can do anything about it. He moved closer, his hand brushing against hers under the water. What if we could? What if we just let ourselves feel it just for a little while? Nomi's breath caught her skin, tingling where his hand touched hers. Curtis, we can't, you know that. Why not? His voice was low, his eyes pleading. Why can't we just explore it? See where it goes? She shook her head, her heart pounding. Because it's wrong. Because we're family. Because it could ruin everything. He didn't respond right away, his gaze dropping to their hands still brushing together beneath the surface. What if it's worth it? Nomi's chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to say no, to shut this down before it went any further, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She could see the longing, the desperation, and it mirrored her own. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. We're playing with fire, Curtis. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and determination. Then let's burn. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Nomi's heart raced as she searched his face, trying to find the courage to say no, to put an end to this before it went too far. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized she didn't want to stop it. She wanted to see where this could go, even if it was dangerous. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a soft, tentative kiss. It was a test, a way of seeing if this was real or just a fantasy. When Curtis responded, his hand cupping her face and his kiss deepening, she knew there was no going back. The water around them seemed to hum with electricity as they kissed, their bodies pressed together beneath the surface. Nomi's hands tangled in Curtis's hair, her heart pounding as she gave in to the moment. It was wrong, so wrong, but it also felt right in a way she couldn't explain. As the kiss intensified, she felt an unmistakable hardness pressing against her, her body. Her breath hitched, her body instinctively arching into his. She knew this was crossing a line, but the heat of his body, the urgency in his touch was too much to resist. When they finally pulled away, both of them breathless and trembling, Nomi looked into his eyes and saw the same mixture of fear and desire that she felt. This is dangerous, she whispered, her Voice shaking. Curtis nodded, his hand still resting on her cheek. I know, but it's also beautiful. The afternoon sun cast golden rays through the windows as Nomi and Curtis stepped inside the house, the air thick with unspoken tension after their charged time by the pool. The water fight had left them both breathless, their playful teasing giving way to something deeper, something primal. Nomi could still feel the heat of Curtis's gaze on her, the way his eyes had lingered on her body as she emerged from the water in the crimson bikini that clung to her curves like a second skin. She knew what was coming, what they both wanted, and yet she couldn't bring herself to stop it. Follow me, she said softly, her voice laced with a playful invitation as she glanced over her shoulder at him. Her bare feet padded softly on the wooden floor, leaving damp footprints in her wake she didn't need to look back to. No, he was following. She could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze burning into her as she led him toward the living room. Curtis hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest as he trailed after her. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, desire, fear, but the pull to her was too strong to resist. He followed her into the living room, the space bathed in soft sunlight that seemed to highlight every detail of her figure, the way her wet hair clung to her shoulders, the way the bikini still hugged her body despite the towel draped loosely around her. It was all too much and yet not enough. Nomi stopped by the couch, turning to face him with a soft smile. Her eyes were dark with something he couldn't quite name, something that made his breath catch in his throat. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his chest as she gently pushed him onto the couch. Sit, she said, her voice a low murmur. Curtis obeyed, his body sinking into the cushions as he watched her with wide eyes. Nomi knelt on the couch beside him, her hand resting on his chest as she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was tender yet filled with unspoken longing. He responded instantly, his hands moving to her waist, pulling her closer. As their kiss deepened, the air between them was electric, every touch, every kiss a slow exploration of the forbidden desire that had been building between them for weeks. Nomi's hands roamed over his body, feeling the contours of his muscles, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips. Her nails dragged lightly down his chest, eliciting a soft moan from him as his hands tightened on her hips. Mom, he whispered against her lips, his voice trembling with need. Please. Nomi didn't respond with words, her action speaking louder than anything she could say. She straddled his lap, her body pressed against his as their kiss grew more urgent, her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as her hips rocked against his, the friction between them sending sparks of heat through her body. Curtis's hands moved up her back, his fingers fumbling with the clasp of her bikini top. Nomi didn't stop him, her breath hitching as the fabric fell away, bearing her to him. She moaned softly, her head falling back as he leaned in, his lips capturing her body in a searing kiss. For a moment they were lost in each other, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that felt both natural and extraordinary. The intensity between them was electric, every touch, every movement bringing them closer to the edge. Curtis's hands moved over her body, exploring every curve, every inch of her skin, as if committing her to memory. As the heat between them reached its peak, Nomi pulled back slightly, her hands resting on his chest as she searched his face. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked into his eyes. The desire she saw there mirrored her own, and for a moment she let herself believe that this was right, that this was where she was meant to be. Curtis, she whispered, her voice trembling, this is wrong, but it feels so right. He nodded, his hands moving to her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheeks. I know, but I can't stop, I don't want to. Their lips met again in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, a silent acknowledgement of the line they had crossed when they finally pulled away. Both of them breathless and trembling. Nomi rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed as she tried to steady her breathing. We can't pretend this didn't happen, she said softly, her voice barely audible, but we also can't let it consume us. Curtis nodded, his hands resting on her hips as he held her close. I know, but I don't regret it, not for a second. Nomi's heart ached at his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her defenses. She knew this was dangerous, knew it was a line they could never uncross, but in that moment none of it mattered. She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips before pulling away. Neither do I, she whispered. The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room where Nomi and Curtis lay entwined, their bodies still humming with the echoes of the night before. Nomi was the first to stir her. Eyelids fluttering open as she took in the sight of Curtis sleeping beside her. His face was peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply watch him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions, affection, guilt, and an undeniable sense of belonging. Carefully she slipped out of bed, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to wake him. She glanced back at him once more, a faint smile tugging at her lips before quietly making her way to the kitchen. The house was quiet, the stillness of the morning wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. She felt a strange sense of calm, as though the storm of emotions that had consumed her the night before had finally settled. In the kitchen, she began preparing breakfast, her hands moving with a practiced ease as she cracked eggs into a bowl and sliced fresh fruit. The familiar routine was grounding, a reminder of the normally she had clung to for so long, but as she worked, her mind drifted back to the night before, to the way Curtis had looked at her, the way his touch had ignited something deep within her. It was a memory that both thrilled and terrified her. By the time Curtis wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon, Nomi had set the table with a simple yet thoughtful breakfast. He paused in the doorway, his hair tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The tension between them was still there, but it had softened, matured into something deeper, more profound. "Morning," Nomi said softly, her voice warm with affection. Curtis smiled, a shy, almost boyish grin that made her heart skip a beat. "Morning." He crossed the room, his movement slow and deliberate, and for a moment it felt as though they were both holding their breath when he reached her. He hesitated, then leaned in to press a gentle kiss to her lips. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sent a ripple of warmth through her. "Breakfast smells amazing," he murmured, his voice low and husky. Nomi smiled, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "I thought we could both use something hearty." They sat down together, their meal a quiet, intimate affair. The conversation was light, punctuated by soft laughter and lingering glances. Every now and then their hands would brush, or one of them would reach out to gently touch the other's arm, and each time it sent a spark of electricity through them. There was a new understanding between them, a connection that transcended words. The flirtatious tension from the day before had deepened into something more profound, something that was both thrilling and comforting. They didn't need to speak about what had happened. It was there, in the way they looked at each other, in the way their hands sought each other's, in the way they seemed to breathe in sync. As they finished eating, Nima stood to clear the table, but Curtis caught her hand, stopping her. She turned to look at him, her heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. "Nomi," he said softly, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Last night, it meant everything to me." Her breath caught her eyes searching his face. "It meant everything to me too," she whispered. He stood, pulling her into his arms, and for a long moment they simply held each other. The warmth of their embrace, a silent promise of more to come. The world outside the kitchen faded away, leaving only the two of them, their hearts beating in unison. When they finally pulled apart, Nomi rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed as she favored the moment. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, "one step at a time." Curtis nodded, his hands resting on her hips as he held her close together.